Hello, everybody. My name is Helene. I run the Europe, Middle East, and Africa business at Webflow. And I'm here with one of our big enterprise customers. David, do you mind introducing yourself a little bit? And Hakim Group and what you do there?
Hello, I'm David, and I head up growth for Hakim Group, which is sort of the combination of our marketing, digital, and CRM teams. And Hakim Group probably takes a little bit more of an explanation. So what we are is sort of an optical portfolio company. So primarily independent opticians, but also eyewear brands, audiology. And what we do is we go in with sort of a joint venture model. So we keep an individual business owner in place, but we then take over the back-end support. So we'll do everything from buying to marketing to naturally their digital infrastructure, etc. But we leave a lot of decision-making power on the ground because we still want them to have that independence as a brand. And we've been moving through a huge amount of scaling up. So I joined the business about 5 years ago, and there was about 80 brands across about 90 locations. And as of today, we've got, I think, 570 locations across the UK and Ireland, sort of spread out over almost 500 brands. So we've got this huge, bulging estate that we're trying to kind of manage and control. And also, we're doing probably about 10 brands in terms of acquisitions a month. So we've got this constant flow of new websites, new systems that need to come across. And so it's how do we manage that as we continue to kind of grow and scale? And that's kind of the position that we're in at the moment.
So talk to me a little bit more about this. Before Webflow, what was the situation like?
I mean, it was chaos. I mean, I'll be perfectly honest, it's still chaos now, but at least there's some sort of rhyme and reason to the chaos, because we were basically trying to manage individual platforms on a almost case-by-case basis. And these are not, kind of mature websites that you're inheriting, which have been wonderfully architected and well-structured. You're getting something that was built in a basement by someone's nephew 10 years ago while they were learning. So you will get the most appalling kind of WordPress sites and some weird custom PHP, and I'll get a Joomla spat at me and a Wix site which is so inherently ugly that it makes you suffer on the inside. And so we'll have all of this coming through, and we're just trying to manage, to update, to optimize. But really, a lot of the time, you're just putting out fires. You're trying to make sure things can stay alive rather than anything else. And as you continue to scale, you look at that, and you almost immediately realize that this is not sustainable. But we also know that that independent presence needs to remain. So it's not like you could just be like, okay, great, we're going to white label all of these and make them all look the same. Because if you're a boutique in Edinburgh in comparison to a kind of a little shop in the arse end of Cornwall, how are you going to manage those different elements? And in some locations in the UK, we could have 10 practices in a 5-mile radius. And so you've got people who need to go into those businesses and still feel that they're an independent. How do you maintain that at scale? And that was kind of the chaos and the problem that we were looking at when we were trying to decide on how we were going to platform and how we were going to architect all of this.
And when you made the decision then, what made Webflow the right fit?
Again, I think we did quite a lot of looking around for this because, I mean, naturally there's a lot of options when we were looking at it. And it was almost when we started to think of it, were we looking for a CMS or were we trying to really radically change how we were going to do our infrastructure in the future? And also internally, we were kind of mostly non-technical across my teams. So if I was looking again, like between the marketing, digital, etc., not a huge amount of technical ability, so we needed something that was still low-code enough that we could keep the speed of build going on, but it had the ability to scale, to give us something that we could actually kind of grow and move forward with. And so when we looked at it, we felt that this was something that could deliver that sort of instant speed when we were delivering it in terms of that insight builder, but there was also a layer behind it in terms of what we could do in the future, and also the fact that it was just writing clean code. I mean, I think in some of our early days of Webflow, what we used to do is we would have some sort of terrible WordPress site somewhere. The team would quickly build it out in Webflow and spit the code out and throw it onto the front end of the WordPress site because it was just the fastest way for a non-technical team to do something. So it was this kind of sense that, okay, we could do the day-to-day well right now. We could keep up with this speed, but there was also a layer of infrastructure and architecture that could be done as we continue to scale. And that's really what tipped us over the edge in terms of, no, this is what the future could look like as we're moving forward.
So can you talk a little bit about this, what has changed, and specifically the at-scale part?
So I think this is where it's really interesting for us, is because naturally I'm speaking about it like, oh, well, we've got, it's architected, we're building things properly, we've got global components coming in. But honestly, all of these things are running at the same time while we're doing them. We're migrating. So we did a lot of the complex sites first in terms of the really rogue ones. We sort of stabled those up, brought them in. But we've still got an estate of probably 250 Wix sites, which are coming across to Webflow this year. Done in support with our agency. But that is a mass migration which is happening. And as we're doing that migration and trying to look at it at scale, it's how do we architect those sites and so that you can build this out using the elements that are there in terms of our global components, in terms of the build capability, so that when we start looking at this in the future, we can start managing them as an estate rather than having to look at them always as a node-by-node element. Because if you're looking at them at our scale, and you have to make a simple change on a website, but you have to go into that website, into the editor, that's 400, 500 actions, and that's suddenly a huge amount of manual load. And we've seen all the stuff that's coming now in terms of, okay, well, maybe we need to restructure a piece of a page. Maybe we need to think about doing things a little bit differently. So what we're trying to understand right now is, as we scale, we need to architect our estate so differently, using how we look at our global components, thinking about our variables, so that we can keep that independent presence, that look and feel that feels individualized, but is suddenly being driven by a lot more of an engine. And that's how we've started to build things. And in this main migration, as we are probably coming to the end of this year, we're looking to have probably about 300 sites on Webflow in terms of that architected estate. And we know that all of that isn't going to be in exactly the position that we want it to be in terms of the linked architecture, etc. But every time we build a site, and as we're looking at these migration processes, more and more of that is coming into play. And you can see it in sort of simple elements and then more complex elements. And we only see this growing and developing. And this is why I'm also always harassing the Webflow team in terms of like, what does the roadmap look like? Because if we're going to do something across 300 sites, I don't want to have to custom do something for a couple of months and then bring it back in. And they're like, oh, well, we do that out of the box now. And so I think that it's a little bit later on in terms of how we're building and thinking about vibe coding, etc., ties into a bit of that as well.
And you mentioned building on top of a platform. What does that actually look like in your case?
Building on top of a platform in?
Like you talked about, we talked a little bit in our preparations around the MCP and how you use that. You've hinted at it, but we haven't really talked about it in detail yet.
So I guess in terms of building on the platform, is this kind of tying into how we've looked at, again, the piece that Miguel just kind of demoed, where we've actually got access to the code to Canvas, which used to have a much cooler name, which didn't make it through, really. Still sad about that, guys. Bring back the original name. But things like that are really fundamental to us as we're looking to build, because naturally, and I imagine everyone in this room is the same, there is so much rapid fire building happening, whether it's within a Claude system, whether it's in Figma or others. All of the team are so engaged with that sort of rapid building. And when we're looking at this, we don't see this as kind of an either or. We don't see this as, oh, well, we can vibe code, build quickly, ship quickly, or we can use something which has an infrastructure, an architecture. We see those things as things that work together really seamlessly. And I think looking at the kind of code to canvas piece for us was really fundamental in terms of how we think we're going to scale and move forward. Because naturally, when we're looking at something which is at the scale of our problem, everything is about, okay, how quickly can we do this? How quickly can we get something out in front of people? And so it's always about speed of shipping. But then you build yourself this massive backlog of BAU in terms of how are we going to edit these sites? How are we going to make sure they're secure, they're proper, they're editable? And it kind of goes into a second factor as well, is because of, like I mentioned at the beginning, each of our websites will have an independent partner attached to it, who's almost an external party. So I'll need that, okay, if they're very engaged, they might want to have some sort of editing rights over that website. And I know that my marketing team will want to have actions that they want to take on the website. And then I know that the CRM team, as they develop and they move things forward, are also going to be wanting to implement things. And so if you're doing that in a purely kind of vibe-coded environment, yes, you can spin up something quite quickly. But how are you going to do that in an architecture which people can then edit and build on and change? And this is really the fundamental for us in terms of how we're looking to do it. We're seeing the kind of the Webflow piece for us as that stable architecture for all of these amazing pieces that we can build and design and roll up so quickly. But we can move them into an environment and then start bringing in things like our global components that make it make sense at a much, much larger level. And so for us, that is really the most exciting thing. And that's why we're always pushing to be like, what's coming next in code versus where are we going to get these different elements? Because we are already doing things with code components in terms of, great, we can roll this out on a multi-site level. We can build things as simple as like a multi-step form in the nicest possible way. When you're building 50 of them, it's so nice when you can just be like, that it is, done. Like those simple integrations for us make such a fundamental difference. And I think it's going to change the way that so many of us build, is having that ability to kind of quickly iterate, get to a prototype level, but then bring it into an environment where you can be so much more specific and also then replicate it and move it across your other properties. Because when we do something well, we want to be able to move that into another property using the variables. And so again, it still looks unique, but we can take all of that learning as we're moving forward. So we really do see this as it's very much a two-hander. We see it as we're really positive around how we're going to be using Claude and all of the other tools to get ourselves to a really good design space. But we see that living within our Webflow infrastructure and building that Webflow infrastructure over time so that more and more of that acts in tandem to give the team the speed that they want, but also the stability and then the ease of edits for people who maybe don't have any technical knowledge as well.
And this morning we talked a little bit about, AEO. How does AI search fit into all of this?
I mean, the board are obsessed with it, and so I think anyone who has sort of, they're going through the C-suite and the board process, AEO is just a massive thing for us. But it is, we're using it quite lightly at the moment. It's on a few of our websites, and we're really just trying to get a feel and an understanding of how we're actually showing up in these sorts of models. But one of the really interesting things around this kind of the shift towards AEO and making sure that we're structured correctly and all of those things kind of goes back to that point of building in a structured way as we're moving through all of these different things. Because if we can build out the global components that are best practice and you can roll them across multiple sites and then trying to think about, okay, great, we can connect that to a database to make sure we're updating content, to make sure that we have fresh content to feed those AEO engines, we can get a really good understanding of that. And so naturally, we do see this as a big piece for us moving forward because, again, we're about to stop looking at it as also just a brand by brand piece. Because right now, again, I can see the reflection of enough pairs of glasses in here that, there's loads of decisions that go into where you would buy eyewear or where you would go in for that kind of service. And we want to start owning that conversation more and more. And the way that we feel that we can do that is a lot more effective in a longer form content piece. And how does that then work across the SEO and the AEO? Works on how we structure those things across all of our sites. What do we do maybe through a central lead gen campaign engine? And what do we do on the individual practices who offer very specialized versions of those services? But again, how can you manage those things in a much more comprehensive and centralized manner rather than having to think about that completely on I have to go into the editor of each of these individual ones to do those updates and move it forward. So the AEO piece and AI search is something we're really interested in terms of how we can communicate with our market, but also what people are saying about us is really interesting in terms of what are the questions that are being asked that help people find us, how and what is almost the structure of those questions that we should have. And that naturally is going to inform some of the things that we do in terms of how we build websites in the future as well.
And slight change again. You talked about our roadmap. What's on your roadmap? What are you building next?
So I think one of the big things for us is we're doing a lot more in terms of our booking journeys because, again, like we've inherited atrocious systems. And I don't know if any of you guys have worked in sort of medical or legacy tech before, but you will end up with a lot of very bad systems, like ones that will really cure the will to live. So we've sort of moved away from a lot of those in terms of how do we integrate with the actual till point systems in our individual locations, and we're building out a lot more comprehensive booking journeys and flows in terms of how does a user actually book into one of our independent opticians. And so we've got a lot of work going in there, sort of modularizing those booking journeys, taking them through either a central piece or on the individual practices' websites, how are they integrated in all of those different places. And it kind of goes back into the simple elements that we said before. If we're thinking about content in a certain way in terms of answering a particular question, can we immediately then integrate a simple booking module so that they can push right into the practice? And honestly, so much of this is so fundamentally simple if you're doing it on a single site. But as soon as you times anything by 500, it just becomes a lot more complicated. And so these are the kind of questions that we're having, is how we're looking at those things in terms of, firstly, a really integrated booking journey that we can track and implement across an estate. And then we've also got quite a big piece, which we're going to be doing, where we're almost going to start talking about independent optometry and independent care in general as a category. So we're going to be launching a new central brand to sort of go into that branding positioning piece that we can build on from earlier. Because if you're looking, and I'm right now looking in the UK and Ireland, but we're also moving into Europe in the near future and North America, it's really hard to communicate on an individual brand level when you have 500 brands in the UK and Ireland. You're basically just constantly cannibalizing yourself. So what we're doing is we're taking a step back, and we're going to say, why would you go for independent care? What would an independent brand do differently for you in terms of your eye health, in terms of your eye care products, and all of these things? And we're going to start talking about those as an umbrella. That naturally feeds into sort of our booking journeys, that emphasizes our practices a lot more. But because of the speed of our growth as well, we see this as an M&A tool, because we're basically saying independent care is the right way for you to go. You should be supporting these independent brands, and we're going to build out the content strategy and all of those things around that. And this is also where we're going to see a massive amount of that AEO context, because we want to be answering all of those questions around eye health, around care, around spectacles, around the fashion elements of frame, pulling those into a central platform and then disseminating them across the network. And this is, again, how we're thinking about our infrastructure. It's always going to be a mix of what do we do centrally, what do we do on the individual brands basis, so that you can talk from a central brand saying independent care is the best version of care. And if you go a little bit further, you're going to find the practitioner or the carer or the brand which is the best for you. And we're going to start controlling those journeys a little bit more and giving people really clean flows in terms of how do we build those things out. So that's going to be something that's separate from Hakim Group. It's going to be a standalone brand which is highlighting independence, but it's going to be built into this same architecture. It's going to be built on the same objectives in terms of how are we making sure that we're highlighting those individual brands still, but we're giving them a bit of an umbrella to say, this is the reason why you should be thinking about them. But then on each of those individuals, they'd be highlighting the individual things that they do really, really well and what separates them from the rest of the market.
Thank you for that. And last question, what would you say to somebody that still thinks of Webflow as just a website builder?
I mean, I think if you're thinking about it just as a website builder, you've probably not maybe looked at the depth in terms of some of the things you could think about in terms of the architecture and the scale, etc. Because I think, and I mean, I'm going to say this, that we're really only starting to understand how well integrated these things can be, how quickly we can ship things, how effectively we can move something from a vibe-coded environment into a stable, controlled environment. So I've started to think about it a lot more as a sort of a safe infrastructure to put things in, rather than just as a site builder. And I think that's been the biggest shift for us recently. Instead of thinking about how can we optimize and how can we build and how can we do these things, it's basically saying how can we make sure that these other pieces that we're doing all over the place actually have somewhere where they can live and thrive, and then how can we make sure that we're consistently delivering something that's unique, but have a level beyond that which makes it a lot easier to manage.
Thank you very much for coming all the way to Belgrade with us, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
That's it.